Everyone loves a good redemption story. A brutal warlord sees the error of his ways, embraces peace, and becomes the best emperor ever. That's the story of Ashoka Maurya, the man who supposedly turned his empire into a paradise of nonviolence after one particularly nasty battle. He put up pillars all over India telling everyone to be nice to each other, promoted vegetarianism, and basically became the ancient world's most powerful hippie. It's a fantastic story. It's comforting. It makes for great textbook chapters. And like most comforting stories from history, it's got some massive, gaping holes in it that are far more interesting than the fairy tale. The origin story always starts with the Kalinga War, a truly horrifying affair where, according to Ashoka's own press releases, over 100,000 people were killed and 150,000 were deported. Seeing this carnage, Ashoka felt deep remorse and converted to Buddhism. Fine, but let's apply a little bit of tactical thinking here. After you've conquered basically the entire Indian subcontinent, what's the best way to hold it all together? More war is expensive and messy, but a state-sponsored ideology about peace and obedience, where the emperor is a benevolent father figure? That's not just piety, that's brilliant, cost-effective imperial management. He conquered with the sword, now he would rule with philosophy. So, Ashoka carves his thoughts on giant stone pillars, the famous edicts. They are full of lovely advice about respecting your elders and not being a jerk. But he also makes it very clear who's in charge. In one edict, he warns forest tribes that while he prefers peace, he still has, and I quote, the power to punish. It's the ancient equivalent of, I'd really rather you didn't make me turn this chariot around. He also created a new class of officials, the Dhamma Mahamatas, whose job was to wander around and make sure everyone was being properly pious and obedient. So it's less kumbaya and more state-mandated morality with government inspectors. Now, we get to the parts that don't make it into the school plays. Buddhist texts, particularly one called the Ashoka Vadana, paint a different picture of our peaceful emperor. In one story, a follower of a rival sect, likely a Jain or a Jivaka, in the city of Pundravardhana, drew a picture of the Buddha bowing at the feet of his own spiritual teacher. A reasonable artistic choice for a non-Buddhist. Ashoka's reaction was, apparently, also reasonable. He ordered the massacre of 18,000 people from that sect. This is what historians call a measured response. He only stopped when one of his advisors pointed out this might be bad for his whole Peace Sky brand. Lest you think that was a one-time outburst, the Ashoka Vadana has more heartwarming tales of imperial tolerance. In another incident, a man in the capital city of Pataliputra did the same thing, drew a disrespectful picture. Learning from his past mistake of only punishing an entire city, Ashoka streamlined the process. He had the man and his entire extended family locked in their house and set on fire. All of them. He then issued a standing order. Anyone who brings him the head of a heretic from that sect gets a gold coin. This, predictably, led to a slight over-enforcement problem when someone killed one of Ashoka's most beloved Buddhist monks by mistake. Whoops! So, why the extreme reaction? Was Ashoka just a secret psychopath? Unlikely. It's about control. By making Buddhism the state-sponsored ideology, he was creating a unifying force in a massive, diverse empire. Any challenge to the image of the Buddha was a challenge to his imperial authority. It was treason dressed up as blasphemy. Furthermore, Buddhist monasteries were becoming incredibly wealthy and powerful landowners, all under imperial patronage. Protecting Buddhism wasn't just about faith, it was about protecting the economic and political infrastructure of the empire. Dissent was bad for business. This grand project of a unified Buddhist state worked for a while. But it turns out running an empire based on state-enforced piety is fragile. Ashoka's successors lacked his charisma and his ruthlessness. The empire was huge, communication was slow, and the whole system was incredibly expensive. All those pillars, stupas, and monasteries don't pay for themselves. The military, which had been the backbone of the empire, was allegedly neglected in favor of missionary work. The empire began to shrink, with provinces breaking away. The Mauryan magic was fading. Fast forward about 50 years after Ashoka's death, we arrive at the last Mauryan emperor, a man named Brihadratha. History doesn't record much about him, which is usually a sign that he wasn't exactly a political genius. He inherited a crumbling empire, a restless army, and a court full of factions. One of those factions was led by his own commander-in-chief, his top general, a man named Pushyamitra Shunga. And Pushyamitra, a Brahmin, was watching this slow-motion collapse and thinking that perhaps a change in management was overdue. Brihadratha decided it would be a great idea to hold a massive military parade to inspect his troops. You know, for morale. So he's there, in front of his entire army, doing his emperor thing. His general, Pushyamitra Shunga, walks up to him, ostensibly to pay his respects. And then, in full view of every soldier in the capital, he pulls out a sword and kills him. Just like that. He assassinates the emperor in front of the whole army. The army, seeing their old, ineffective boss dead and their respected general holding the bloody sword, basically just shrugged and accepted him as the new king. It was the most brutal job interview in history. The traditional story is that this was a Brahminical revolution, a backlash against the Mauryas and their obsessive promotion of Buddhism at the expense of the traditional Vedic or Brahminical traditions. Later Buddhist sources certainly portray Pushyamitra as a monster, a new villain who burned monasteries and slaughtered monks. They claim he put a bounty on the heads of Buddhist monks, a dark echo of Ashoka's own alleged policy. This narrative is neat. It frames Indian history as a simple conflict between Buddhism and Hinduism, a battle for the soul of the subcontinent. And like all neat historical narratives, it's probably wrong. The evidence for Pushyamitra's grand persecution is actually pretty thin. It mostly comes from Buddhist texts written hundreds of years later, when they needed a good villain for their own stories. Archaeology tells a different story. Some of the most famous Buddhist sites in India, like the Great Stupa at Sanchi, were actually renovated and expanded under the Shungas. So what was Pushyamitra? A rabid persecutor or a pragmatist? He was a politician. He likely stopped the massive state funding for one specific sect and spread it around. He wasn't anti-Buddhist, he was anti-Mauryan. He was against a system where one ideology, backed by the state, held absolute power. The killing was just business. So the Great Mauryan experiment ended not with a bang, but with a coup at a military parade. Ashoka's attempt to create a unified empire of peace ironically, might have set the stage for its downfall. By tying the state so closely to one faith, he made political dissent and religious dissent the same thing. He created a system where attacking the king's faith was the only way to attack the king. He wanted to end violence, but his methods, at least according to some sources, involved mass murder for the crime of drawing the wrong cartoon. It's a perfect historical irony. The man famous for giving up violence may have accidentally created the template for religious persecution in India. Humans have always been great at this. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, nerds!